Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into a story of fate, prophecy, and the unimaginable legacy of a hero who was bound to fall. Picture this: a newborn baby, a cry piercing the air, and an ancient prophecy echoing through the halls of time. Achilles, the son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, was born not just into a world of gods and men, but into one of cruel fate. The moment of his birth was marked by a dark prophecy, one that foretold that the boy, destined to become the greatest warrior Greece would ever know, would also be fated for an early death. The gods themselves trembled at this prediction. They knew that Achilles, with all his power, could never outrun the shadow of death that loomed over him. His mother Thetis was faced with an impossible choice: protect her son from this grim fate, or let him grow to fulfill the prophecy now. Before you start thinking this is just another myth, let's zoom in a bit. Did you know that the ancient Greeks believed that the gods were often so unpredictable that even they couldn't avoid their own fates? Imagine living in a world where even the gods are powerless against the hand of destiny. Crazy, right? Historians still debate how much control the gods truly had over fate. Were they merely messengers of the inevitable? Or were they, too, at the mercy of a force far greater than themselves? For Thetis, the decision was both heart-wrenching and seemingly inevitable. She knew that her son would grow to be a hero whose name would echo through the ages, but she also knew the price. The prophecy said it all. Achilles could not escape the fate of death in his prime. So, what does a mother do when the only thing she can do is try to delay the inevitable? Well, she turns to the gods for help. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not share where you're listening from and what time it is in your neck of the woods? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The prophecy hung over Achilles like a storm cloud, dark and foreboding. His mother Thetis, in a desperate bid to save him, turned to the ancient powers for a solution. There was only one way to protect her son from death's icy grip. She would dip him into the river Styx, the river of the underworld. The Styx was believed to have the power to grant invulnerability, making those who bathed in its waters immune to harm, invincible to mortal blows. Thetis, though a powerful goddess herself, was still bound by the limitations of even the divine. She could not fight fate directly. She couldn't change what was written in the stars, but she could delay it. And so, she carried her infant son to the banks of the Styx. She held him tightly, whispering promises of protection, of a life filled with greatness. In one final act of defiance against the will of the gods, she submerged her son in the river, submerging him entirely, except for one small part: his heel. That heel, which she held in her hand while dipping him into the water, was the one place she could not reach. And thus, Achilles was born anew, a near-immortal warrior with a single vulnerable spot: his heel. Now, here's where it gets a bit more eerie. You might have heard of the term Achilles' heel, which today is used to describe a person's only weakness. Funny how a single small detail: his heel would become Achilles' downfall, even though the rest of his body was impervious to harm. Historians still argue whether Thetis's decision to hold Achilles by his heel was an act of fate, or whether it was a flaw in her love, an unintentional mistake that would ultimately lead to his end. Can you imagine being invulnerable everywhere, but one tiny spot? It's like being a superhero with a single flaw in your invincibility. Some say Achilles' mother could have dipped him again to make him fully invulnerable. But perhaps, even in her divine wisdom, she knew that no hero, no matter how powerful, could escape their destiny forever. Now, dim those lights a little more, because the twists of fate are just getting started. Achilles grew up with the kind of tutelage that made him a legend before he even knew it. Thetis, aware of the prophecy, wasn't about to let her son's destiny be decided by mere fate. She took matters into her own hands. To keep him hidden from the world, she entrusted him to Chiron, the wise and noble centaur, who had the reputation of mentoring the greatest of heroes. If anyone could shape a boy into a hero worthy of the gods, it was Chiron. You can imagine the set upright, the son of a goddess, hidden away in the mountains, raised by a half-man, half-horse creature. It's a bit like a mystical version of an elite boarding school, except, instead of calculus and football practice, Achilles was learning the arts of war, strategy, and survival. Under Chiron's guidance, Achilles honed his strength, mastered the use of weapons, and developed into a figure who was far more than just a boy. He was a force waiting to be unleashed. But Achilles wasn't the kind of guy to sit idly by. He wasn't content just with the knowledge and skills Chiron provided. He was driven by an inner hunger, a thirst to prove himself, to be more than just a sheltered child. As he grew, he began to catch the attention of even the gods themselves. The boy who had once been submerged in the Styx, now a towering figure of raw power, was impossible to ignore. Historians argue whether Thetis truly understood the consequences of hiding Achilles from the world, keeping him safe and isolated. Was this the best move, or did she inadvertently stifle his ability to form relationships, perhaps even his emotional growth? Was he simply a weapon in waiting? One thing's for sure, Achilles wasn't made to sit quietly in the shadows. He was made for glory, and soon the world would come calling. It's funny, isn't it? All those years of training and isolation in the mountains, and yet the moment Achilles stepped out into the world, everything about him screamed, hero. He was built for greatness, but greatness like a flame burns hot and fast, and it was only a matter of time before he'd be called to the front lines. Now, let's settle into the next chapter of his life, where war would beckon, and destiny would come rushing at him like a wave crashing onto the shore. As Achilles grew stronger, he became a figure of both awe and dread. The boy who had been dipped in the river Styx was no longer just a figure from prophecy. He was a man, albeit a fiercely skilled and frighteningly capable one. The might he possessed made him not just a warrior, but a force of nature, one that had the potential to bring armies to their knees. But Achilles wasn't just about brawn. Underneath all that raw power was a mind that was as sharp as the weapons he wielded. His reputation spread across the lands like wildfire, and it wasn't long before he caught the eye of kings and warriors alike. He became a name whispered among the most powerful of men, each hoping to gain his favor for their own wars. But Achilles was not one to serve for the sake of service. His loyalty was to himself, his destiny, and perhaps most of all, to the idea of glory. If a war had the promise of eternal renown, he would be there. If it didn't, he'd rather stay in the shadows, where no one could tell him how to fight. Historians still argue whether Achilles' desire for glory and immortality through battle was the defining aspect of his character, or whether he was just another product of a violent, war-driven society. Was his thirst for fame a sign of narcissism, or was it simply the way heroes were bred in ancient Greece? Heroes like him weren't born in peaceful times. They were born from the call of war, driven by a need to prove themselves to the gods and to the world. But here's the kicker. Despite his immense power, Achilles wasn't invincible. No matter how many enemies he slaughtered, no matter how many victories he claimed, Achilles was still bound to the whims of fate. He may have been dipped in the Styx, but he wasn't immune to the pull of destiny. The prophecy still lingered, even as he stood among the greatest of warriors. His name would forever be tied to the Trojan War, the place where his legacy would truly unfold. And that, as we know, is where the true test would begin. So now, with the world watching, it wasn't just a matter of whether Achilles would prove himself. It was about the war that was brewing, the Trojan War, a conflict that would demand the very best of all, who were drawn into it. And you can bet that Achilles, with his burning desire for glory, would be right at the heart of it all. The spark that set the Trojan War ablaze came from an act as ancient as human desire itself: love and betrayal. It all began when Paris, the Prince of Troy, took Helen, the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. This wasn't just a case of infidelity. It was a royal snatch-can grab that would ultimately tear apart the fabric of the ancient world. When Paris ran off with Helen, he didn't just steal a queen, he stole the pride of Greece. Menelaus, enraged by the theft of his wife and the insult to his honor, called upon the other Greek kings and warriors to unite and take back Helen. They gathered on the shores of Aulis, ready to set sail for Troy. But there was one catch. They needed Achilles. Despite his early years in hiding, despite his absence from the broader political world, Achilles' name had grown too large to ignore. The prophecy, the rumors of his near invincibility, and his hunger for glory had reached every corner of the ancient world. Achilles was the hero the Greeks needed to lead them to victory, and he knew it. However, Achilles wasn't exactly jumping for joy. He had no love for the political squabbles of kings, or the idea of fighting for a stolen woman. He wasn't there for Helen, nor was he particularly interested in the glory of the Greek kings. But there was something that called to him from the depths of his soul, the prospect of becoming the greatest hero the world had ever seen. And, as the saying goes, when you're a warrior like Achilles, you fight for one thing above all your name. Historians still argue whether Achilles was motivated purely by his desire for glory, or whether his involvement was driven by a deep-seated sense of duty to his people. Was he acting out of pride, or was he fulfilling a destiny that had been thrust upon him from the moment of his birth? Either way, when the call came, Achilles answered, and so, with his army of warriors in tow, he set sail for Troy, ready to face whatever challenges fate had in store for him. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the Trojan War was about to become the battleground for his legacy. Achilles' arrival at Troy didn't go unnoticed. The very presence of the nearly invincible warrior sent waves of unease through the enemy's ranks. The Greeks, united under a single cause, were now emboldened by Achilles' might, while the Trojans, with their walls and their cunning, braced themselves for the oncoming storm. But despite the obvious advantage of having such a powerful warrior on their side, the Greeks faced a different kind of problem. Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces, king of Mycenae, had the arrogance of a man who believed he was invincible in his own right. When Achilles landed on the shores of Troy, there was no grand welcoming or heroic display, an immediate clash of egos. You see, Agamemnon had been promised the spoils of war-captured women, treasure, and land. However, when he was forced to give up his war prize, the beautiful captive Brises, to Achilles because of a dispute with Apollo's priest, his pride was wounded. He could not stand the idea of Achilles receiving greater honor than himself, and so, in a display of petulance, Agamemnon took Brises from Achilles, not as a warrior, but as a king who believed his right to power was unquestionable. Achilles, unsurprisingly, didn't take kindly to this. The anger that had simmered in him for years, the rage that had been built on betrayal and disrespect, boiled over. The man who was meant to be the Greeks' greatest weapon now turned his back on the army. He withdrew from the battle, taking his warriors, the Myrmidons, with him. No longer would he fight for the Greek cause. If Agamemnon thought he could outshine him, he would see the consequences. Historians still debate the wisdom of Achilles' decision. Was this an act of pride and personal vengeance? Or was it a calculated move to show Agamemnon who truly held the power? Achilles' absence from the battlefield, however, would soon become more than just a matter of personal honor. It would spell disaster for the Greek forces. And here's the twist. The Greeks, now without their greatest champion, began to falter. The tide of war turned. Achilles, sitting on the sidelines, watched as his countrymen fell one by one, and the once unbeatable Greek army struggled to gain any ground. His heart, though full of pride and anger, began to feel the weight of his decision. But pride, as we all know, has a way of clouding judgment, and the consequences of Achilles' withdrawal from the fight would soon become clear. The Greek army's struggles grew with each passing day. Achilles, with his myrmidons at his side, remained in his camp, nursing a wound to his pride, while the war raged on without him. The Trojans, sensing an opening, surged forward, gaining ground that seemed impossible just weeks before. Every victory the Trojans claimed added to the tension back in the Greek camp, and it didn't take long for the realization to settle in. They needed Achilles. But even then, Achilles remained steadfast in his decision. He had made his point. He was a force beyond Agamemnon's control, and he would not fight for an army that disrespected him. It was his anger, a burning flame that threatened to consume him entirely, that kept him from rejoining the fray. The Greeks were in disarray, yet Achilles, despite his unrivaled strength and unmatched prowess, chose to stay away. His pride had become his prison, and the war, once his stage, had now become a backdrop to his internal conflict. The turning point came when the Greeks suffered a devastating blow. Hector, the Prince of Troy, a warrior of unparalleled skill and valor, led a charge that pushed the Greek forces back to their ships. Hector's force was unstoppable, and the Greeks were on the verge of losing it all. In one particular battle, the Greek leaders, desperate and realizing they could not win without Achilles, sent emissaries to his camp. They offered him gifts, promises of greater honor, and even Agamemnon's apologies. Achilles, still brooding in his tent, saw the approach of the Greek envoys, but he did not open his heart to reconciliation. Instead, he responded with bitterness. The anger that had been bubbling beneath the surface for so long now had a target. His pride was so deeply wounded that it overshadowed even his desire for glory. Historians often debate whether Achilles was justified in his anger or if it was a tragic flaw that cost him the chance to save his people. Was he simply too proud? Or was his betrayal by Agamemnon too deep to ever forgive? Even with the Greeks pleading for him to return to battle, Achilles remained unmoved. The only thing that could move him now was the death of someone he loved, someone who would make him reconsider everything he stood for. As Achilles turned his back on the Greek cause, the winds of war began to shift in ways that would leave irreversible scars. And it was a loss so close to Achilles' heart that would change the course of the war forever. The winds of war blew harsh and unforgiving, but it was the loss of his beloved companion Patroclus that would finally drag Achilles back to the battlefield. Patroclus, who had been Achilles' closest friend since childhood, was more than just a warrior in his own right. He was Achilles' emotional anchor, the one person who could reach him when no one else could. The bond between them was the kind of deep, unspoken connection that transcended simple camaraderie. They were soulmates in every sense of the word. Patroclus, seeing the Greeks on the brink of collapse and knowing Achilles' rage, took matters into his own hands. He donned Achilles' armor, hoping to rally the Greeks and turn the tide of battle. With the guise of Achilles himself, Patroclus led the Greek forces into battle, fighting with a fierceness that mirrored his friend's legendary strength. At first, it worked. The Trojans were thrown into disarray at the sight of what they thought was Achilles charging at them. But despite his best efforts, Patroclus was no match for Hector, the Trojan prince. In the heat of battle, Hector and Patroclus faced off, and though Patroclus fought valiantly, he was slain by Hector. The news of his death reached Achilles like a thunderclap, shattering whatever resolve he had left. The grief that washed over him was a torrent, a suffocating wave that left him hollow. It was the kind of grief that only comes when a part of your soul is ripped away. Achilles, for all his strength and rage, had always been human in his capacity for love and loss. Historians still argue about the depth of Achilles' grief. Was it the loss of his closest friend that drove him back into the war? Or was it the crushing realization that the prophecy, the one he had tried so hard to outrun, was now beginning to unfold? The death of Patroclus was the catalyst that shattered his prideful defiance. The hero who had refused to fight for his own people was now consumed by a need for vengeance, not just for the Greeks, but for Patroclus, for the bond they shared, and for the life that had been taken too soon. Achilles, now driven by an unrelenting thirst for revenge, made a vow. Hector would pay for Patroclus' death, and nothing in the world would stop him from fulfilling that vow. His rage, previously a source of pride and defiance, had now become a weapon of destruction, one that would destroy not only Hector, but whatever semblance of peace remained in his heart. With this newfound fury, Achilles re-entered the battlefield, ready to face the one who had taken the life of the person he loved most. The war that had once seemed distant now burned with the heat of his vengeance. Troy and the gods themselves would soon feel the consequences. Achilles' return to battle was nothing short of legendary. The moment he donned his armor once again, the very earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet. He wasn't just a man now, he was an unstoppable force, fueled by grief and rage, his heart set on one singular goal: revenge. The Myrmidons, his loyal warriors, followed him into battle without question. They knew that with Achilles at the forefront, there was no foe too great, no obstacle too insurmountable. When Achilles reappeared on the battlefield, it was as if the sun itself had risen anew. The Trojans, who had been emboldened by his absence, now cowered at the sight of the warrior they feared most. The very thought of Achilles, standing tall, invulnerable, and furious, sent shivers down their spines. Even the gods in Olympus watched with a mix of awe and trepidation, knowing that the course of the war would change irrevocably in the face of Achilles' wrath. But this wasn't just about vengeance, it was personal. Achilles had already lost Patroclus, the only person who could make him second-guess his impulsive decisions. Now Patroclus' death had left Achilles with nothing but the dark, consuming fire of anger. Every step he took towards Hector was like a step toward fulfilling the prophecy of his own death. But in that moment, Achilles didn't care about fate. He cared only about one thing: avenging Patroclus. The clash between Achilles and Hector, the Trojan prince, was inevitable. It was a battle of two of the greatest warriors of the age, each driven by different motives, but bound by the same tragic fate. The fight was brutal, two titans, locked in a deadly dance, each strike ringing with the weight of the gods themselves. For a while it seemed as though the gods themselves were taking sides. Watching closely as the fates of these two men intertwined, Achilles' rage was evident in every swing of his spear, every strike with his sword. Hector, despite his skill and bravery, was no match for the fury that had been building in Achilles for so long. The duel was short but catastrophic. With one final devastating blow, Achilles drove his spear through Hector's throat. Hector, the noble prince of Troy, fell to the earth, his blood staining the ground. But Achilles, for all his power and triumph, did not feel victorious. His heart, still heavy with grief and rage, could find no satisfaction in Hector's death. He had won, but at what cost? The victory was hollow, and in the midst of his triumph, Achilles dragged Hector's lifeless body behind his chariot, an act of disrespect so profound that even the gods recoiled. This was Achilles, consumed by vengeance, no longer the hero he had once been. Historians still argue whether this act of desecration was a true reflection of Achilles' character, or whether it was a moment of madness brought on by his deep grief and unrelenting anger. Was this a desperate attempt to hold on to his humanity, to keep his emotions raw and real? Or was it the final step in his transformation into something darker, a hero no longer bound by the codes of honor? The death of Hector marked a turning point in Achilles' journey, but it also highlighted the very nature of Achilles himself, a hero who, despite his near invincibility, was torn apart by his emotions. He had avenged Patroclus' death, but in doing so, he had crossed a line, showing a side of himself that even the gods could not ignore. Achilles, consumed by his rage and grief, had abandoned honor for vengeance, leaving behind a legacy of destruction that would only haunt him further. The Greeks, though relieved to see Hector fall, were no longer certain how to handle Achilles. He was their greatest warrior, but he was also a volatile force, a man whose actions now seemed driven by the darkness within, And yet, even in his fury, Achilles remained a symbol of glory. His return to battle had given the Greeks hope, but the cost of that hope was clear. Achilles was no longer the man who fought for a cause. He fought for his own twisted sense of justice. The gods who once had seen Achilles as the shining star of the Greek army now watched him with wary eyes. His behavior was unsettling, unpredictable, and beyond their control. And yet, the war continued. Though Hector had been slain, Troy was not yet defeated, and the gods knew that the final act of the Trojan War would involve the gods themselves more directly than ever before. The winds of fate, though relentless, were far from finished with Achilles. His actions, his brutality, his pride, his grief would lead him down a path toward a final confrontation with his destiny. But Achilles, in the throes of his victory, paid little mind to the consequences. As he dragged Hector's body around Troy, his mind remained fixated on the idea of revenge. He showed no remorse, no regret. His grief, his rage, had made him blind to everything but his personal vengeance. The gods looked on, knowing that the moment of Achilles' downfall was near. He was a hero who had pushed the boundaries of honor, and fate was ready to collect its due. Historians continue to debate whether Achilles' wrathful treatment of Hector's body was an inevitable consequence of his own internal turmoil, or whether it was simply an example of a hero who had lost his way. Was this a calculated act of vengeance? Or was it the final fracture in the soul of a man who could no longer bear the weight of the world on his shoulders? The gods, now deeply involved, were about to play their part in the unfolding drama, and Achilles would soon face consequences that even his strength could not overcome. The winds of fate turned once again, as they so often did in the world of heroes and gods. Achilles, so deeply entrenched in his anger and grief, had forgotten the very essence of what made him a hero of honor. He had driven his spear through Hector's heart and dragged his body around the walls of Troy. But this brutality was not the end of the tale. It was merely the prelude to a more profound lesson, one that even Achilles would be forced to learn. The gods had been watching, and their patience was nearing its end. In response to Achilles' treatment of Hector's body, the gods decided to intervene. They could no longer stand by and watch as this hero, a man so close to godhood, yet so vulnerable, destroyed himself in his pursuit of vengeance. It was the king of the gods, Zeus, who stepped forward to deliver a decree. Hector's body was to be returned to his family. The honor of a warrior, even a fallen one, was too sacred to desecrate even in the heat of battle. Achilles, despite all his power, was still a mortal subject to the laws of the gods, no matter how far he had pushed them. In a rare moment of humility, Achilles was visited by the god Apollo, who pleaded with him to show mercy to Hector's family. Apollo, who had long been the protector of Troy, demanded that Achilles return Hector's body, and even though Achilles was consumed by grief, the intervention of the gods brought him to his senses. It was an act of reconciliation with the forces that had created his world. The gods, and a reminder that even the mightiest of heroes were not beyond their reach. It was a turning point for Achilles, a moment of reflection amid the chaos. He had been a warrior driven by rage and vengeance, and now, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, he was faced with the reality of his actions. The gods, despite all their power, could not stop the war, but they could offer guidance. Achilles, torn between his sense of duty to the Greeks and his love for Patroclus, was now forced to face the consequences of his own heart. Would he continue to be the instrument of destruction, or would he honor the humanity in himself? Historians still debate whether this intervention by the gods truly softened Achilles' heart, or whether it was simply another chapter in the tragic tale of a hero who could never escape his destiny. Was he ever capable of true redemption, or was he always bound to the violent end that awaited him? The act of returning Hector's body to his family was symbolic of recognition that the cycle of vengeance must come to an end, even if it had taken far too long to reach this point. But for Achilles, the weight of his actions could never be fully erased. His heart may have softened for a moment, but the shadows of his past, of Patroclus' death, of the war, of his own arrogance, remained. The gods had shown him mercy, but Achilles still had one final battle to face. The prophecy of his death, which had hung over him since the moment of his birth, would soon catch up with him. And it would be far more final than anything the gods could decree. As the war progressed, the shadow of Achilles' fate loomed ever larger. Though he had returned Hector's body and briefly reconciled with the gods, the curse of his prophecy was unavoidable. Achilles, despite his triumphs on the battlefield, was still a man, and all men are bound by the inescapable thread of fate. The prophecy that had haunted him since his birth was a constant reminder that no matter how strong or invulnerable one might be, the final hour always comes. The Greeks were rallying under Achilles' leadership once again, pushing the Trojans back. However, despite all his victories and the fear he instilled in his enemies, Achilles knew that the end was near. He had already lived more than any hero could dream. He had earned immortality through the tales of his deeds. But the gods had made sure to remind him that immortality did not come without its price. His name would live forever in song and story, but the cost would be his life. The fatal moment arrived when Paris, the very man whose act of love and betrayal had ignited the war, shot an arrow towards Achilles. The arrow was guided by the hand of Apollo, who had long held a grudge against the Greek hero. With a single, well-placed shot, Paris' arrow struck Achilles in his only vulnerable spot, his heel. The prophecy had been fulfilled. It was a moment of tragic irony. The very thing that made Achilles invulnerable, his strength and his near invincibility, could not protect him from the fates that had been written for him. In that instant, all of his rage, all of his battles, and all of his glory were brought to a screeching halt. The mighty Achilles, the hero who had once seemed untouchable, was brought down by a single strike. Historians still argue whether Achilles' death was the culmination of his own tragic flaws, or whether it was simply the inevitable result of the war he had chosen to fight. Was it his pride and anger that led him to this moment, or was he simply a pawn in the hands of the gods, unable to escape the inevitable? As Achilles fell, the Greeks mourned, and the Trojans, though their enemy, felt a sense of relief. The man who had terrorized them, who had embodied death on the battlefield, was gone. The gods, however, saw his death as the end of a chapter that had shaped the very course of the war. His fall was as much a victory for fate as it was a loss for the Greeks. Achilles had been the hero they needed, but now that he was gone, they would face a future without him. For Achilles, the end had come, but his legacy would live on forever in the tales of his heroism and his tragic fall. He had fulfilled the prophecy. His death came young, but his name would never fade. He had lived for glory, but his death reminded the world that no hero, no matter how great, could outrun their fate. Achilles' death marked the end of an era, but it also signaled the beginning of a new chapter in the Trojan War. His absence was felt not just by the Greeks, but by the gods themselves, who had watched him with both awe and fear. The loss of their greatest warrior left the Greek army in a vulnerable position. Without Achilles, the morale of the Greek forces began to wane. The once unbeatable warriors, now bereft of their shining star, found themselves struggling against a resurgent Troy, led by Hector's brothers and the gods who favored the Trojans. But even in death, Achilles' legacy could not be ignored. His name continued to haunt both sides of the war, a symbol of unmatched strength and the tragic fate that awaited all men, no matter how heroic. The Greeks, who had once rallied behind him, now fought on without their champion. Yet they had learned from Achilles. They knew that the war would continue, and they would have to fight without the man who had been their unstoppable force. And in the absence of Achilles, new leaders would rise, leaders like Odysseus, who, though not as powerful, were capable of maneuvering and outthinking their enemies. But it wasn't just the Greeks who were affected by Achilles' death. The Trojans, too, felt the loss. Hector, The noble warrior who had fallen to Achilles' wrath was now remembered as a martyr. The Trojans rallied around his memory, knowing that the Greeks' greatest hero was gone. But the gods, ever mercurial in their favor, could not let this moment go unnoticed. The gods of Troy, with their hands in the strings of fate, now shifted their focus to the new champion, Paris. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War could have ended differently had Achilles lived longer. Could the Greeks have won sooner? Would the gods have intervened as much? Achilles had been the key to the Greek war effort, and with him gone, the Greeks had to find new ways to fight. But no one could replace him, not in strength, not in valor, and certainly not in the stories that would echo for generations to come. For Achilles, the gods had played their part. The prophecy was fulfilled. He had died young, but in doing so, he had left a mark on the world that would never fade. His name would be immortalized in song, in poetry, and in the hearts of those who would tell his story for centuries to come. But death, as always, was the great equalizer. Even the gods could not prevent it. His fall was inevitable, and the hero who had once stood at the pinnacle of his power was now gone. The war would continue. The gods would meddle, and heroes would rise and fall. But Achilles' legacy, his tragic story of glory, grief, and fate would never be forgotten. His death was the end of a hero, but it was also the beginning of his eternal fame. For Achilles, there was no escaping the prophecy. But in the end, that prophecy had made him a legend. In the wake of Achilles' death, the Trojan War neared its devastating conclusion. The Greeks, although bereft of their greatest warrior, still had their wits and determination. They were not a people easily defeated, and while Achilles' absence left a gaping hole in their forces, they were far from ready to surrender. With leadership shifting to figures like Odysseus and Ajax, the Greeks adapted and fought on. Achilles' death had left an undeniable mark on both the battlefield and their hearts. Hector, their noble champion, had been killed by Achilles, and now their greatest hope for victory lay in the hands of Paris, an unlikely hero, whose actions had started the war in the first place. As the war dragged on, Paris, still driven by the guilt of having caused so much destruction, now had the responsibility of carrying Troy's banner. The gods, who had once guided the hands of Achilles and Hector, now turned their attention to Paris, their favor shifting like the wind. But Paris, though a warrior, lacked the same glory, the same honor that Hector and Achilles had embodied. He was a hero by accident, not by design, and his involvement in the war was more of a consequence than a choice. Historians still debate the role of the gods in shaping the final days of the war. Were they the true architects of fate, or were the mortal heroes simply pawns in their hands? The gods had played both sides, favoring both Achilles and Hector at different times. Yet it was Paris who would ultimately seal the fate of Troy, but in a way that few could have predicted. He shot the final arrow, the one that would pierce the heart of Achilles, ensuring his immortality not through battle but through death. His arrow was guided by Apollo, but it was not his skill that killed Achilles, it was fate. The gods, once again, had shown that no mortal could escape their grasp. The Greeks, their numbers now dwindling and their spirits tested, continued their siege on Troy. But the fall of their greatest warrior and the destruction of Troy became inevitable. The story of the Trojan War, once a tale of glory and heroism, was slowly turning into a tragedy that would echo for millennia. The gods, the heroes, and the mortals alike would pay the price for their roles in the Great War. But Troy was doomed, and the Greeks would eventually breach its walls through cunning rather than brute strength. The legendary horse, a symbol of Greek ingenuity and subterfuge, would deliver the final blow to the once great city. Achilles, even in death, had paved the way for the Greeks' final victory. His name would forever be intertwined with the downfall of Troy. Though he would not live to see it, his legacy remained a force that shaped the outcome of the war. It was his wrath, his grief, and his unyielding spirit that had brought the war to a head and would forever define the Trojan War's legacy. Historians continue to question the nature of heroism. Was Achilles truly the greatest hero, or was he simply the one whose fate we most remember? Was his glory worth the price of his life? The Trojan War, in all its complexity, serves as a reminder that no hero is beyond fate, and no story is ever as simple as it seems. Achilles, though gone, would forever be remembered not just for his strength, but for the profound impact he had on the world that came after. As the Trojan War finally came to its tragic end, the fate of Achilles became part of the very fabric of history, woven into the tales of both gods and men. The city of Troy, once proud and mighty, lay in ruins, and the Greeks, though victorious, had paid a high price for their triumph. The loss of Achilles was irreplaceable, but his legacy was everlasting. The war, which had spanned a decade, would forever be remembered for its heroes, its betrayals, and its heart-wrenching losses. Achilles, who had once stood as the ultimate symbol of strength and glory, had died young, fulfilling the prophecy that had been foretold before his birth. Yet, in his death, he achieved the immortality that he had sought through his actions. He was no longer just a warrior. He had become a legend, a myth passed down through generations. The songs of his deeds would echo through history, and his name would be spoken with reverence, forever synonymous with heroism and sacrifice. In the years that followed, the Greeks returned to their homeland, and the stories of their victories and losses took on a life of their own. The heroes who survived, like Odysseus, were forever changed by the war, but it was Achilles who remained the greatest of them all, even in death. His story was one of unrelenting pride, fierce loyalty, and ultimate tragedy. It was a tale of a man who was both larger than life and tragically mortal. Achilles had been a hero, but he was also a man, and in the end, it was his humanity that made him unforgettable. Historians have continued to grapple with the true meaning of Achilles' life and death. Was he the greatest hero because of his strength, or because of the choices he made in the face of his inevitable demise? Was his desire for glory a curse, or was it the very thing that drove him to greatness? The answers, as always, are elusive. Achilles was both a product of his time and a figure whose struggles resonate with all who face the conflict between duty, pride, and destiny. As the sun set over the ruins of Troy, the warriors who had once fought alongside Achilles now stood at the precipice of their own legacies. The world would remember the fall of Troy, and in that remembrance, Achilles would forever remain a symbol of what it means to live and die by one's own code. His death, though tragic, marked the end of the war and the fulfillment of the prophecy that had bound him to his fate from the very beginning. And as the years passed, the story of Achilles would be told again and again, not just as a tale of war, but as a reminder of the cost of glory, the price of vengeance, and the inescapable nature of fate. His life, though short and filled with strife, would continue to resonate through time, echoing in the hearts of all who heard his name. Achilles, the hero who was both a god and a man, would never be forgotten.